I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. We accelerate ideas into real companies through the Tacklebox membership, and we think through startup strategy every Wednesday on the Idea to Startup podcast. You're here because you're thinking about an idea, or you're ready to launch something, or you already launched something and you're running full steam ahead. We're here to help with the counterintuitive stuff. On to it. Today, we're going to build a Concierge MVP live on the show. There is no better way to bridge the gap from having a customer you think might want their problem solved to having a customer who's paid you to solve a problem and now you know what you need to do next than a Concierge MVP. It's a big jump that most entrepreneurs think is way farther away than it actually is. So we'll do it. And because it's a beautiful spring day and I'm feeling loose, we'll try to build a Concierge MVP for an idea that a listener wrote in with by specifically saying, quote, "There's no possible way to build a Concierge MVP for this idea." Well, I guess we'll see about that, David. David was the name of the person who emailed. A Concierge MVP is exactly what it sounds like. We've done a 20-minute skills episode on the nuts and bolts of Concierge MVPs, and I'll put it in the show notes. Basically, you help your customers solve a problem in the way your product eventually will, but instead of a functional product, there's just you, the white-gloved concierge guiding your first customers through the process and jumping in to solve problems whenever you can. It reminds me a bit of Jerry Seinfeld's joke describing the luge, where he says, "It's done on the bobsled run, but there's not even a sled. It's just Bob." That's the Concierge MVP. Just Bob. The huge value is that it allows you to get close enough to your customer to identify the most painful part of their process. Then you take that bit off their plate. You own it. You figure out how to productize and scale it, and that becomes your business. Sometimes this is hard to visualize, so we'll kick it off with a quick example. A few years ago, a founder went through Tacklebox who'd worked for big nonprofit organizations for years. One of her main roles was awarding grants to promising startups. Her organization would give $50, $100, $500,000 grants, often to startups hoping to solve massively important societal problems that required lots of R&D. These were companies figuring out ways to regrow a coral reef or using algae to help combat fertilizer runoff. The founder came to Tacklebox to build a tool to help the startups find those grants. She was always blown away by how few applications they'd get for each grant, to the point that she'd gotten a pretty big marketing budget to spread the word. This seemed wild because most of these companies survived by winning grants, but visibility seemed to still be a problem. She ran some customer interviews and landed on a Concierge MVP that would deliver a list of all the available grants to the customer, along with the questions on the applications, a schedule of due dates, and any connections the founder already had to each grant. This was done through LinkedIn connection search. And in case you're wondering, yes, of course I suggested she name her company Don't Take This for Granted. And no, she didn't even consider it. But I'm a professional, so I didn't take it too hard. Anyway, startups were surprisingly lukewarm on the idea once she actually asked them to sign up. But one, a close connection to the founder, finally agreed. A week in, our founder delivered a list of 15 grants, to which the customer responded, "How the heck am I supposed to apply to all of these? I am a scientist, not a full-time marketer, and I'm not good at telling our story anyway, so we probably wouldn't get them." The most painful part of the process had bubbled up to the surface, and our founder had an epiphany. Awareness wasn't the problem. Writing was. Creating a persuasive argument when you were supposed to be doing science. So our founder moved away from finding grants and shifted to take the grant writing problem off her customers' plates entirely. She hired a freelance copywriter who interviewed the scientist founder for an hour and then built a core argument that could easily be adapted for most applications. Our founder then handled those applications and submitted them. She's now building a company that owns and productizes that moment, helping scientists translate their big ideas into persuasive grant applications that could keep their company afloat. And that is what Concierge MVPs do. They get you deep insight into what the actual bottlenecks are for your customer. They help you find a wedge, nail messaging, build testimonials and social proof, and most importantly, eventually pick the right first customer. Best of all, a Concierge MVP is a forcing function for you as an entrepreneur. You need to deliver value. You're on the hook. It toughens up your skin. I do get a lot of pushback on the Concierge MVP thing. Founders say they love the concept, but their specific idea is not conciergeable. They need to build an actual full-featured, well-designed product to show their customers to test it out, so they need to pay that dev shop $50K or get that thing built or whatever. This is their one shot, they say, and their customer isn't going to use anything that isn't perfect. That is just the fear talking. Your strongest instinct is always going to be to avoid discomfort, and being faced with the actual value of this idea you're so excited about is scary because that value might be nothing. It probably is nothing, and wouldn't that be uncomfortable to find out? But obviously, you want to find it out immediately if that's the case, and then you want to thrash around and get to something that does matter. That is a little bit more comfortable. In 10 years of doing this with thousands of startups, I am yet to find the idea that cannot be concierged. B2B SaaS products, coffee shops, high-end soap, digital SAT tutoring, we have done it all. Today is meant for you to get more confident with this method. There is nothing here you aren't capable of. We'll run a Concierge MVP for David's idea, the un-Concierageable one, and along the way, we'll nail down the 4-step framework that you can follow. Defining wild success, acquiring customers, the test itself, and the feedback loop. If you do end up building a Concierge MVP after this episode, email team@gettacklebox.com and tell us about it. So let's get into it. After a little smooth jazz. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job and want to test out the former before you leave the latter, come and work with us. Apply at gettacklebox.com. Over 400 startups have tested and built ideas through our program, and those businesses are now collectively worth over $1 billion. Our program helps you prioritize and execute, and our members and me and the team keep you accountable and give you feedback along the way. Come build with us at gettacklebox.com. David's idea. The idea we'll mess around with today came from our friend David, a guy who emailed after listening to the original Concierge MVP pod a few months back. Here is his email, used with permission, of course. Hey, first-time writer, long-time listener. Editor's note, I must have made a joke about this at some point because lots of people email in with variations of this joke, and I'll tell you what, I'll take it. Gets a chuckle from me every time. It continued. I just listened to the Concierge MVP episode, which I loved, but I've got a problem. My idea cannot be tested with a Concierge MVP. That part was in caps and bold. Dave means business. Here it is. I've recently moved in with my girlfriend and gotten engaged. We're starting to combine everything, including finances. We've decided to get one credit card and dice up the charges at the end of the month, but it's gotten really complicated. We have things like rent and car payments, streaming services, and to make it all more complicated, we're each freelancers, so we have our own business expenses too. For the first 4 or 5 months, we'd get together on Sunday with a printed out credit card bill and dice it all up. This took forever, and when tax season came around, it was a mess. Eventually, I built a little internal tracker with Notion, Zapier, and QuickBooks. Basically, now when either of us have a new charge, it pops up in Notion and has a bunch of tag options for me. So I can assign it to myself for work or personal, or tag it for tax purposes, or comment on it if I want, and then at the end, I mark it as complete and it disappears. I think of it like Gmail, except every email is a transaction. So the first thing I want to build is that financial inbox. I want to help people get to finance inbox zero. I did a bunch of interviews with new couples and asked questions like, how much money do you all have right now? And how much money do you owe? And how expensive of a car can you afford? And once we all got past the initial awkwardness, basically no one I spoke with had any answers for any of these questions, and each terrified them. The problem is, how can I possibly do a Concierge MVP? I would need people's credit card statements. And if I'm getting that, I can't look like some fly-by-night business with a Squarespace account and Gmail address. No one is going to trust me unless this is super legit, right? We'll see, David. We will see. Concierge MVP Step 1, the 3 components of wild success. People tend to get really excited about Concierge MVPs because it feels like your first chance to build a product. And it is. So founders start throwing out feature ideas immediately. I reached out to David shortly after getting his email and asked a question. If you were going to build a Concierge MVP, what would it look like? He started listing features. He said it'd need to pull in bank accounts, and we'd need a weekly email with a dashboard, and on and on. This, again, is natural, but the complete wrong way to go about starting a concierge MVP. The centerpiece of your test needs to be what we call wild success. The moment you create where your customer's problem is completely solved. There's a good chance that the problem you're trying to solve doesn't have an immediately clear moment for wild success. Maybe you're helping someone lose weight or speak Romanian, and there isn't a natural wild success moment for either. This just means you've got to find a smaller feedback loop and separate that from the longer one. There needs to be something, we often call it a wedge, that provides immediate value, a way to build trust and push the customer to the next point with you. This part of the process always reminds me of a saying I've referenced before about the monkey and the pedestal. It goes like this. Let's say someone told you that you had 1 month to get a monkey to stand on a pedestal in the middle of your town square and recite Shakespeare. How much time would you spend building the pedestal? The saying is meant to remind you to spend every ounce of your effort on the thing that matters. And it often reminds people that they are spending enormous amounts of time on the pedestal tasks, the things that are straightforward and easy and make us feel like we're making progress because, hey, the pedestal does need to get made eventually, right? But that's a waste of time. The hard thing, getting a monkey to recite Shakespeare, is the point. Once you think you've found a customer, anything that isn't figuring out what wild success would be for that customer and how you could deliver it to them is a waste. So every concierge MVP starts with that question. What does wild success look like? When I asked David, he struggled. Well, he said, success is tricky because for our customers with debt, that might be getting a plan in place to figure out how to pay it off. For the couples splitting a credit card, maybe that's dicing up the fees or creating budgets. People can do lots of things with the inbox I built and the tags, and that is why it's so exciting. This is a textbook response for founders that have come up with a solution they really like. They focus on capabilities, what people could do with this tool. But that's pedestal stuff. The monkey is specifics. What customer with what problem will you help reach wild success? And what exactly does that moment look like? So, wild success has 3 components. First, customer. Second, problem. And third, detailed description of the moment that problem is solved. These form your hypothesis for the test, which you should write out at the top of any test document. X customer has Y problem that they desperately want solved, and if we solve it, they'll end up at Z moment of obvious success. When I sent this framework to David, he responded with a clear customer and problem. During his interviews, he spoke with couples that were thinking about moving out of a city and into the suburbs. They'd rented apartments their whole lives and didn't really understand what a life in the burbs would look like financially. How much could they spend on a house? How much did owning a house cost each month? What new expenses were going to pop up and what expenses would go away? I could preload these things in, he said, almost like a financial model. I could help them get a full-scale view of their financial lives and make recommendations. I heard people over and over say that they were terrified of being, quote, house poor, where they bought a house that was too expensive and crippled the family's finances. Lots didn't even know if they could afford a house at all. I could help. Okay, kind of cool, I think. This was his top-level hypothesis. Quote, couples moving from the city to the suburbs don't know what they're likely to spend in their new life, so they aren't sure what they can comfortably spend on a house, or if they can afford one at all. They'd love to get financial clarity as to where they are in this exact moment. There's still a ton of ambiguity around customer. Couples isn't anywhere near as specific as I'd like. If you listen to this podcast, you probably predicted that. And the wild success moment, being confident in the amount of money you can spend on a home, I am not positive about that. But the test will be the judge. On to step 2, young David. Step 2, acquiring customers. Problem language and the Indiana Jones swap. Your concierge MVP is going to look like a big funnel. You'll try a bunch of stuff to get cold customers in the top of it, then you'll try to help them in the middle of the funnel, and hopefully some come out the bottom with a bit of wild success they can share with other potential customers. The big test of your wild success hypothesis is to see if it's compelling enough to get cold customers into the top of the funnel in the first place. This has everything to do with momentum, specifically seeing how motivated your customers are to solve this problem already. You already know that you can't create momentum to solve a problem. You can only latch on to a customer's existing momentum. As I've said a million times before, you can't convince someone to go buy an iced coffee, but if they're already out on their way to buy one, you can convince them to try yours. The Concierge MVP tests this momentum, and here are the logistics. Logistics of acquiring customers: what to say and where to say it. Now is the time for problem language. Our brains speak problem, not solution, so specific language about the problem you're going to solve is going to convert customers at the highest rate. This is also the time for our wild success language, which follows problem language and is a reaction to it. This is your problem. Here is where you'll be once it's solved. And finally, there's one more type of language that's helpful here. I call it the Indiana Jones swap, based off that scene in Raiders where he swaps the bag of sand for the idol, which might age me, but that movie rules. You describe the horrible, painful struggle the customer has now, then you show what that turns into once they work with you. Here is the most painful part of your process, and I am going to take it off your plate. As for where you put this messaging, the best place is obviously where your potential customers have the highest likelihood of seeing it. This starts with warm connections. Customers you've interviewed, friends who know potential customers and can pass this along, social channels. It then moves to colder connections, cold emails, LinkedIn messages, or a personal favorite of mine, physical places. Finally, what assets do you need for this? First, you need copy for a cold email or social ads or wherever you're putting that problem in success language. And second, you likely need a landing page, which will have all three messages: problem, success, and swap. I explained all of this to David, and after he gave me some vague messaging about couples moving to the burbs, we got him to a specific customer. And that is the best way to build these. To pick a perfect representation of your customer segment, a real actual person you've spoken to who's got a name and goals and thoughts and feelings, and then you build the entire test for them. David picked a couple he was friends with who were hoping to move from a studio apartment in Brooklyn to a town in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York. He knew they'd considered renting their apartment for another year because they weren't sure how much they could spend on a house. They had loans and were thinking about a kid and were stressed out about the commitment. After a conversation with them, he realized that they were dragging their feet because they were scared to know exactly where they stood financially. They even used the example of not getting a test at the doctor because they were scared of the result. So he tweaked his problem language. Quote, "You haven't bought a house because you're getting married and you've got loans and choppy freelancer income and you might have a kid soon. You have no idea how much money you can spend on a house, and frankly, you're a bit embarrassed by that fact." His wild success language became, quote, "We help you know exactly what you have, owe, and can spend on a house in less than a week." His swap became, quote, "You've tried everything from QuickBooks to Mint to you need a budget, but none of them help you get any financial clarity. We take that off your plate entirely." He pushed this messaging to people over email, he built a landing page with it, and he designed a postcard with that on it and went to Prospect Park in Brooklyn and handed it out to couples walking around on Sunday morning. His call to action read, "We work with couples who are also freelancers or self-employed, people with choppy, unpredictable finances. Sign up here and we'll send you a quick and dirty Excel calculator that'll get you started." Step 3, the test and our old friend, the SOP. There are a bunch of ways to build the actual test, the value you deliver, but they're pretty startup specific, so I won't go too deep on them. The big thing to know is that your test needs 3 components. First, a way to get information from your customer. Second, a way to share information back with your customer. And third, a way to get feedback. The call to action should kickstart the information getting, whether it's a type form that you send or a survey or a few questions in an email or whatever will create some momentum, something that you can use to give a bit of value. Once you've got that value, you want to package it up and deliver it in a way that helps the customer make a decision or solve a problem. This shouldn't be overwhelming and should be blindingly obvious. Here is some value, and here is how you use it. And finally, you need to get some feedback. This is usually best done through a call at the end or during the process. I spoke with David and asked what he needed from his customer to deliver value, and he said minimum 3/4 of account activity on the main credit card and their salary over the same time. Great. But if you're asking for that much, you've got to be promising something really valuable in return. This goes for any Concierge MVP. If you're going to white glove this, you'll need their help, which means you're going to need a serious promise. David reached out and asked for this information, and he promised a lot in return. Details on how much they could spend on a house, what their financial life would look like with various mortgages, what their monthly bills would look like with the city expenses gone and estimated suburb expenses added, and then scenarios with kids. They wound up needing a phone call with David to ensure this was safe, but they did it. And on the back end, David pulled together his Airtable document and then pulled in a favor from a friend who was a financial advisor to get more insight into the whole thing. He built the financial inbox he talked about and started by tagging every expense himself so he could show the impact to his customer. Then he made a Loom video walking through a new expense page he made that showed how their finances could change. Finally, he gave housing ranges and even included some listings off Zillow in the town they were looking at. That is white glove service. And as he went, he built an SOP, a standard operating procedure, for how he built the Airtable doc and implemented what the financial advisor said. The goal was to standardize and productize the financial intake. The whole thing went pretty well. And most importantly, he learned the stickiest parts of the process and he learned the real value he delivered. This leads us to the last part, the feedback loop. Step 4, closing the feedback loop. Every test you ever run with customers should be 1 part product, 3 parts feedback. The whole point of all of this is clarity into your customer's process. The more you know about that process, the better product you can build, the bigger moat you'll have against competitors. At the end of the test, get on a call with customers. This is often easy early on before you start charging because you can say that in lieu of payment, a 45-minute call is expected and walk through every step. Show them the landing page and ask what part is most compelling, what's most confusing, what they think you should highlight. Ask how they describe the service to a friend and see if they've already spoken with anyone about it. Ask what moment jumps out and ask if they were running your business, what they'd do first. Speak with them about wedges and test out any new ones you've found. Quote them a price that feels 3 times higher than you think it should be and ask their immediate reaction. Ask them about the risks they felt and what helped them move forward anyway. The idea with each test is to take what you learn from the bottom of the funnel and plug it into the top. To come up with a new or tweaked hypothesis, customer problem success. To try a new channel, to lead with a new call to action. A concierge MVP should feel uncomfortable. That's how you know you're separating yourself. You should be nervous and anxious and worried about delivering what you promise. You should put yourself on the hook. You should build up your pain tolerance. I recommend mapping each of these out on a giant whiteboard or on Miro, which is whiteboard software I really like and I'll put in the show notes. Then compare them, build SOPs, create asset libraries. Get good at this. It's going to become your business. The end. 85% of the way there. The problem most entrepreneurs have with concierge MVPs is they get 85% of the way to something really interesting and then they quit. They get a landing page out and get some customers and maybe the survey doesn't get a ton of responses and so they quit and tell themselves the whole thing didn't work. Or they get one concierge MVP done and it goes fine and they learn a lot and have plans for a second, but it feels too daunting and so they don't. This sort of thing happens all the time and it breaks my heart because you get so close, so much further than nearly every other person with a startup idea. Concierge MVPs are uncomfortable, which is a feature, not a bug. It means it'll push most people away from this, but not us. Discomfort equals growth. It means we're onto something. So try a concierge MVP. Make it easy on yourself. Pick one person and build it specifically for them. Stack the deck so that they're successful. Then get another person like them and try it again and again. Make them cheap and easy to run. Get enough context to choose a customer that can anchor a serious business. You can do this. Don't take it for granted. I still think she should name the business that. But again, I'm not upset. I'm a professional. I'm fine. This was the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job, head to gettacklebox.com and apply. We'll get back to you in 72 hours and can be working together by the weekend. Have a great week.